Good morning, students. In this class, we will be discussing modernism and its characteristics. So, trying to give out a definition for modernism is, is a difficult thing because modernism actually it is not modernism, it is actually modernisms. It is a complex and contested label which has which represents a pluralistic complexity, and all those critiques of literary studies try to talk of separate modernisms rather than of one overarching modernism. It is actually a loose retrospective label which only came into regular use in literary studies by 1960s. And there was never, as I said earlier, there was never any single movement or grouping of writers who actually identified themselves as modernist. So it comprises a range of discrete literary and artistic movements whose various elements together help to define what we mean by modernism. So these movements include naturalism, symbolism, imagism, futurism, cubism, vorticism, expressionism, and surrealism. So, in the light of such a long list, we can describe modernism as an appallingly explosive fusion. And there is this Bradbury who puts in his essay What Was Postmodernism? He says that the simple truth is that there were many modernisms, the movements of modernism, which almost never called themselves modernist, maintained constant hostilities, espoused different ideologies, served under different flags. But we should say that these discrepancies seemed to be pulled together to give a new direction with the publication of two modern texts. One is James Joyce's Ulysses and T.S. Eliot's long poem The Wasteland. From there, a new age in literature had arrived. This English language modernism is usually defined as the experimental and innovative literature of the period roughly between 1890 and 1939, and critics have emphasized formal or technical experimentation over newness of theme or content. As I said earlier, for some critics, modernism, which is also termed as high modernism, only meant James Joyce and a handful of other radical innovators such as Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf, Dorothy Richardson. But for others, we have a different set of critics who have an expansive view of the term and apply it to a much wider range of writers and across a broader period. So, in this class, we will be discussing the main features of modernism. So, as I said earlier, modernism in poetry is distinguished by its pluralistic complexity. we have a synthesis of different kinds of poetry, including the polished formalism of the 1890s, symbolism of W.B. Yeats, imagist values of economy and precision of expression. Although it took different forms in different poets, in individual poets, they generally shared the feeling that they were moving in a new direction. And there were some kind of common strains visible in all these individual poets. So we are trying to bring out all those features we see in these writers, these poets. So the first one will be the break with tradition. There was this sense of a dawning of a new age, which was visible by a shift from tradition. So it was a new cultural movement, and as Dennis Brown notes, in literature it abolished textual continuity. In music, it abolished what is known as harmony, and in painting, it abolished perspective. And this break with tradition was very much deliberate. The poetic intentions of the new literary era was actually loudly announced by Wyndham Lewis, Wyndham, Wyndham Lewis, Lewis, who actually played a key role in grooming Ezra Pound. So there is this first issue of a magazine named Blast, in which Wyndham Lewis actually listed several pages of items to be blasted. That's why the magazine is titled Blast. Blasted many traditional notions. So there was this decision to liberate art from the chains of the past, which was translated into energetic action by Ezra Pound's Imagist doctrines, which this Imagist doctrines actually gave the initial thrust, initial force to this major change. So that was the first feature, the break with tradition. Now comes the second feature, the new in subject matter. So this was the great achievement of modernism, that there was this immense extension of subject matter. There was this resolve to reject romantic conventions, which was actually the consequence of a serious awareness of the new realities of human life. And there was this desire to recreate that felt reality, the lived experiences. And as a result, we see that the focus of these works, of their works, shifted to themes of the city rather than the countryside. Their themes shifted to sexuality rather than romantic, and to human corruption. So we have the works of Carl Sandburg, Chicago Poems, and T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. These are the examples where we see the newness in subject matter. So, in brief, we should say that it projected the varied facets of contemporary life without romanticizing them. And the third feature is formal experimentation. Modern poetry was distinguished by much formal experimentation. So these experimental impulses were a response to the newness of the age. And moreover, this artistic innovation was supported by a plethora of magazines. We have Poetry and the Literary Review in Chicago, Broom and Dial in New York, Blast, The Egoist, and The Criterion in London. We see that these magazines extended their generous hospitality to writers who wanted a place to bring out their new aesthetic assumptions. And we see Ezra Pound as a motivator and a key player who insisted that research had to be done among poetic forms so that each formal development caused the next new one. So he encouraged experimentation with different forms in poetry. And he was the one who announced the coming of the great English vortex. It is actually, please search for this term, great English vortex. It is actually the creed of vorticism, a new movement known as vorticism, which came after imagism, by which Ezra Pound urged that poetry is concentrated presentation as opposed to elaboration. It is poetry is actually a concentrated presentation rather than elaboration. So there was this enthusiastic pursuit to experiment which led to important changes in poetic style. We see concreteness, economy, and exactitude of expression, which defined new stylistic norms. And the preferred phrasing was colloquial. There was this effort to incorporate the rhythms of the spoken language so that the poetry sounded almost like a conversation, which reflected the general trend towards a new realism. So, the perfect example are these lines by Ezra Pound in a station of the metro. It sums up this feature. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bow. So these lines sums up this feature of modernism. Now we have the fourth feature, that is discontinuous composition. So this discontinuous poem is marked by the absence of linking phrases, lines, or topics. So these poems were completely devoid of linking phrases, lines, and topics. So it doesn't evolve gradually from part to part, but places separate units of meaning, disparate units of meaning, one after the other. And often these units of meaning are presented in elliptical fashion. So the best example will be Ezra Pound's Hugh Selwyn Moberly and T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. So it was T.E. Hume, Hulme, Hume, who saw the destruction of the principle of continuity. And he said that this destruction of this principle of continuity is actually an urgent necessity of the present. He was actually speaking, he was actually acting as a spokesperson for all the pioneers of the modernist mood. They saw continuity as a romantic illusion which is not at all suited to express the modern experience. So, all these psychological theories too supported their conviction that poetry must be an interrupted sequence of new images. So, the effect of discontinuous composition is a complex, total impression imaging the ultimate character of reality. So, that is the fourth feature. Now we have the fifth feature, the use of free verse. We see the rejection of traditional verse patterns. So there was this argument favoring free verse, which they believed that it's best suited to the demands of the new party for directness and concreteness and economy. And they believed that these all these emotional states are unique, and every emotional state requires one particular rhythm. So it was a first step towards bringing poetry closer to the direct utterance of living people. And we should say that these modernist writers were inspired by two sources: the verse of the poems written by Walt Whitman, American poet, and all those poems written by French writers like Rimbaud, Laforgue, and Moreau. But we should say that not all modernists subscribe to the doctrine of free verse. For example, we have T.S. Eliot. His poem, The Wasteland, was written in traditional meters with some irregular variations. But we see the increasing use of free verse, which reflected a desire to make the language of poetry sound more natural, like the spoken language. So that was the fifth feature. Now we have the last feature, it is the renewal of tradition. As I said earlier, we talked about the modernists rebelling against the traditional notions, traditional concepts. Although there was this rebellion against these traditional notions, they had this desire to originate fresh forms of language which did not entirely bind them to the value of tradition. It was clear that one couldn't continue in the conventions of the 19th century, but it was neither possible for them to de-link completely from the past, to de-link the present completely from the past. That was also impossible. So, as we see Eliot, T.S. Eliot, asserting in his essay, Tradition and Individual Talent, he says that the tradition is constantly being modified by individual talent. So, there was this literary newness which was redefined in terms of a relationship with the past. So, we see the liberal use of quotations and allusions which acted as a structural paralleling to the resolution to renew by adapting familiar materials of form and language. So there was this liberal use of quotations and allusions from the past, but it was actually in a way to renew the familiar materials. So, for example, in the wasteland, there is this renewal of tradition which serves to illuminate the similarities as well as differences between past and present. On the whole, we should say that literary modernism is a complex matter combining stylistic experimentation with conventional moral standards. This stylistic innovations effected through the use of myth and allusion to which a modern relevance was given to which actually served to make for qualities of intensity and compression. And such a style, we should say that, was appropriate to mirror the dissonance of modern life. Thus, the poetry of this period reflects the condition of man in the modern world. The references to the past through quotation or allusion sharpen one's sense of the present but offer no solution to the problems of man in the modern age. His rootlessness, his loss of identity, his weakening of moral confidence, all these emotions get reflected in the poetry of that period. So there is this packed, dense, often obscure, often difficult, but also exact and precise style which was developed by modernists, which actually became a more authentic reflection of reality. So when you read modernist poetry, modernist works, we see that their works are stripped away of a lot of decoration and flourishes of previous literary movements. Modernist writers found their world to be cold, industrial, and alienating, and they believed that the old methods of storytelling will not work for them. So they created new narrative forms. So these are the features of modernism. In the next class, we will be dealing with all those modernist writers and we will look at individual writers and you will get a better understanding of what is meant by modernism. So in this class, we were trying to give out a definition, but we should say that there is not a single movement, it is modernisms which comprises separate different movements, which actually I said it is an appallingly explosive fusion, and We were trying to give out the common features of these modernist movements. I hope you got an idea about modernism. If you have any doubts, please contact me. So, thank you, girls. Have a nice day.